So, good afternoon to everyone who's joined this webinar on supply chain risk management. Risk management, of course, in organization is becoming increasingly more important as supply chains grow in complexity. So we all need to learn how to navigate these rapid changing environments, including rapid changes in technology, disruptive technology. A lot of us have a maze of suppliers and sub-suppliers to deal with. There's changing international trade laws happening all the time. And of course, not to mention natural disasters that all end up interrupting or disrupting our supply chains. So supply chain risk management, SCRM, as we're going to call it on this webinar, allows us really to methodically identify, assess, and mitigate the risks that are associated with managing a supply chain. So my name is Ahmed Ghanoum, and thank you for joining us once again. It's my pleasure to walk you through this webinar where we will be exploring the fundamentals of supply chain risk management. Now, this is a live webinar, of course, so you may have some questions as we go along. If someone has any questions, please leave those in the chat pod, and I'll make sure to come back to them either in real time, or if I don't catch them, we'll spend a few minutes Q&A towards the end of the session. So first of all, before we get into the actual contents, I just want to illustrate the need for supply chain risk management. So all you have to do nowadays is, of course, to go on your internet browser, you go on your social media. This week, at least, the headlines that we're seeing are all to do with, the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, and a lot of those headlines specifically are to do with the disruption the coronavirus is having on supply chains. A lot of the products out there, whether it's cars or mobile phones or even furniture, a lot of them are either made in China or have a component that's made in China, or maybe even a sub-component that's made in China. And if you cannot ensure supply streams for those components, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a disruption in your supply chain. In fact, this week, Nissan announced that one of its plants in Japan will be shutting down because of because of interruptions to the supply chain. And Hyundai had the same thing in South Korea last week, where they shut down their plants. So this is why we talk about this. This is just an example to show you, why we need to have risk management practices to correct or to protect our supply chains and to ensure the sustainability in the face of not just obviously virus outbreaks, but in the face of changing laws, changing regulations, and so on, so that once the problem happens, you are already ready and able to overcome that challenge. So today we're going to be doing the webinar in 3 short parts. First, we'll be talking about supply chain risk in general, so we'll provide an overview. After that, we're gonna really focus on 2 things: the risk identification element of risk management, and also the risk response element of risk management. Obviously, risk management is a lot wider than that, but time permitting, we can only focus on these 2, which I really think are the most important ones. Now, starting off with supply chains, just to give you an overview of what the supply chain is. So you might operate in a company that produces a product. You might be a retailer over here. You might even be all the way at the beginning of the supply stream. So it could be a mining company or a farming company or even a fishery. So what happens usually is your company will have a supplier, and the supplier will have a sub-supplier, and this might go on for 6 or 7 years before you actually get to the source of the product. But if you have a disruption anywhere on that along that supply chain, so you could have, let's say, an earthquake, like what happened, in Japan a few years ago. You can have a recession that impacts production. You can have a corporate scandal, bankruptcies, etc., etc., etc. And any one of these problems is going to disrupt your supply flows. Okay, either it will constrain your ability to produce at high efficiencies, or it's going to shut you down totally. Also, it might increase supply chain costs, because sometimes you have to pay more for the same product, either because there's more demand on the product or because there's simply not enough supply. a lot of the time, what ends up happening is your customers don't like it, either because the price went up again, or the delivery is late. So that could decrease customer service. And finally, the quality of the product itself might not be, you might not have the same integrity of the product or the service that you're offering because of those interruptions. So again, any interruption anywhere in the supply chain is going to interrupt your flow of goods. Now, just a couple of things on supply chain before we get into the actual process. One thing to keep in mind is that supply chain risk in general is very, very dynamic. What that means is that you might have a risk today that disappears tomorrow, or you might have risk that suddenly appears out of the blue, like the coronavirus was there, only a month ago or 2 months ago, and now it's there. It's a reality. Now, why are risks so dynamic? For a couple of reasons. The first one is because the market is dynamic by nature. So you have new players, you have changing tastes, you have trends, you have different requirements from the end users. So the market keeps changing. Organizations keep changing. Your company gets bigger, it shrinks, it expands. You can grow organically, inorganically. You might take over another company, and also strategies evolve. So anytime your organization, anytime your strategy or the actual market environment changes, you're going to find that these risks actually are going to be changing as well. Now, when you talk about risk, also one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about risks, perception has a lot to do with how you assess or analyze a risk. So someone might be willing to take a huge risk. Someone might be very risk averse, depending on their risk appetite. But at some stage, all of us are going to have to take a risk. Okay, so investing in a new company is a risk. Trying out a new supplier is a risk. Changing the specifications of your production is a risk. Moving warehouses, transporting your goods in a truck, all of those are risks. The idea is not to remove the risks. The idea is to understand what level of risks we are willing to take on, and then how do we do these without impacting the cost structure that we have, the delivery schedules, the quality standards that we have for ourselves, and of course, you want to maintain flexibility. Now, there are different ways for approaching the risk management process. So let's say, okay, we have risks. We want to manage our risks as an organization or indeed as a supply chain. When I say a supply chain, I mean from end to end, from the farm to fork, if you're in food, or from the mine all the way to the consumer. So there are different approaches. What all of them have in common is a planning phase. So first of all, you need to develop the templates, develop the approach that you'll be using to manage your risks. The next step is to identify risks. So we're going to be talking today, we're going to take a deep dive here on identifying risks. Once you identify the risks, you need to say, okay, is this a big risk or a medium risk or a small risk? Now, this is typically, the evaluation of risks is typically done on two levels, if you want. So the first level is, what is the probability of a risk being realized? Okay, so is there a big chance something happens or not? So let's say you have an 18-wheeler loaded with 25 tons of product worth $100,000. Okay, and you're driving it from point A to point B, and you want to say, okay, what's the risk that truck is going to have an accident? So that risk can be analyzed based on historical performance. So we've made that journey 200,000 times in the past. How many times did we have an accident? Or did we get into an accident? And from there, you'll say, okay, it's a low risk, medium risk, or a high risk. So that's the first thing. What's the probability of risk happening? And the second thing is, if that risk happens, so if the truck does get into an accident, what is the impact of that on my supply chain? Is there going to be a high impact? Am I going to lose all, $100,000? Is it going to be a medium impact where I lose, $10,000 or $15,000? Or is it a low impact? So nothing happens. It's just, a basic delay in the delivery. Planning your risk response. So that, again, is the second area we're going to focus on today. So today we're going to focus on identifying the risks and responding to the risks. We're going to look at 5 different strategies, and we'll see how they apply to supply chain management. And the last step is controlling the risks. Okay, so day to day, now I have my risk plan. I'm running my operations. Am I doing all right or not? Are there gaps? Are there places where I need to, brush up my game? That's part of controls as well. Now, to come back to identifying the risks, the first thing we're going to talk about today, what you want to do is you don't want to go out randomly and start saying, "Hey, there's a risk if if I move cargo from point A to point B. There's risk of theft, risk of an accident, risk of obsolescence because I'm not going to end up using the product." But you don't want to just start throwing risk on the table. You want to have a proper structure so that you make sure that you're covering all the risks and nothing is really counted twice. You don't want to double, count your risks. So there are 5 ways that I'm proposing here. The first one is simply by saying, you know what, some risks are internal. These are under my control. Everything to do with product quality, everything to do with employees, my trucks, my warehouses, my facilities, etc. Others are externally driven, external risks, things to do with the environment, political situation, changing laws, changing trends, and so on. So that's the first one. The second approach is to follow the CPOC approach, which is basically risks to do with the S for supplier, I, risks associated with the input, P, process, O, the output, so what's coming out of your factories or any other process, and C, the customer. The third approach is the value chain. So how am I adding value? If I break down my product, again, let's say we're talking about a pizza, okay, and what are the risks associated with producing a pizza? I can go all the way from planting the raw material, processing it, cooking it, delivering it to the client. Every step that I take in the value chain actually adds value, but also brings a lot of risks with it. And this is what we need to figure out. The fourth approach is the one we're going to be looking at today, which is the SCORE, the Supply Chain Operations Reference. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the fifth approach, which is the work breakdown structure, that's really just a project-based approach. So if I have a project, what I'll do is I'll take the scope, I'll break it down, and I'll look at the risks associated with each of those parts of the scope. Let's take an example of how you might identify risks. Remember, we're identifying risks here using the SCORE approach. Now, the SCORE tells us what? It tells us that every entity or every rung in the supply chain does really 4 things. The first thing you do is you plan. After you plan, you source your material, then you make something out of that material and you deliver it to the customer. Okay. Now there's an additional thing that we do, which is managing returns. We've talked about that in a previous webinar on reverse logistics and reverse supply chains. You see the word return twice because it's one thing receiving returns from a customer, and it's another to actually return goods that you purchased from a supplier. So these are the activities that we do at a very high level, at the strategic level, as entities within the supply chain. And the idea becomes, okay, let's look at each of these. And let's look at the risks associated with these areas. Or similarly, let's look at supplier-associated risks, customer-associated risks, and risks that are to do with my institution. So you will analyze all of those risks and you'll come up with a nice little charter. Now, we won't be getting into a lot of the details over here, but I would like to cite here a survey conducted by Supply Chain 247, where they surveyed companies, thousands of companies across different industries. And the top 10 risks that they identified were, the first one is obviously supplier issues and delivery disruptions. As a supply chain, you care about supply, okay? It's in the name. And these could happen for a different number of reasons, okay? Changing technologies, changing laws, weather delays, you can find the availability of the fleet, and so on. That's going to always be the top risks that we as supply chain professionals are going to have to deal with. The second risk they identify is the changes to legal regulations. Okay, so one day you are sourcing items from a certain country, suddenly a new law comes out and says, okay, no more importing from that country. Or they introduce new taxes, or they introduce laws to do with the specifications of the raw material. We see that a lot in the plastics and chemical industries. Number 3 is manpower-related concerns, especially when you're heavy on logistics, so drivers and warehousing professionals. The competition is obviously a risk, so whether you're inviting new competitors or whether the competitor is taking a bite out of your pie, so you have risks over there. Raw material prices, especially if you're buying commodities. things like sugar, steel, aluminum, bauxite, coffee, because all of those are actually a burst. So the supply changes from minute to minute based on supply and demand. So if you plan your sourcing at a certain price, and the next day, the price goes down, you're committed to a higher price, that might result in a loss. Number 6 is the general economic conditions. So if you have a downturn in the economy, obviously, and the rest, okay, I'll go through quickly, 7 to 10, changes in the environmental regulations. So here, things to do with the carbon emissions and associated factors. Breaches of technology, currency risk exchange. So we see that in certain countries more than others, especially if you're buying from abroad and the exchange rate keeps going up or down, that might impact as well your profitability. And finally, force majeure leading to interruptions, such as the novel coronavirus, the COVID-19 that we're dealing with today. Now, you do your charter, you've identified all the risks, you assess, you evaluate your risk, you say, okay, what's the probability of that thing happening? So let's say the coronavirus, probability of it happening was really low. Okay, but if it happens, what's the impact? The impact has proven to be extremely high. So some things are low impact, low probability, others are high, low, low, high, or high. So what are we gonna do about it? Broadly speaking, there are 5 things we can do when we identify a risk. The first thing is to actually accept the risk. And you say, you know what? Everyone has to take a risk. And this is within the scope that I've set myself. I'm going to take the risk. I'll give you a very simple example. You want to cross the road to get, to wherever you're going. And there's a risk you get hit by a car as you cross the road. One thing you can do is stay home all day, spend your life at home. Or the other thing would be to say, you know what? There's a risk, but I'm willing to take that risk. Another approach is to say, you know what? By the way, the acceptance will be determined by the risk appetite set by the organization. The other thing is to say, you know what? Forget about it. This is too risky for me. I'm out. Okay. So sometimes you might exit a certain market, exit a certain product, a certain raw material. You might say this risk is not for me. A third thing we can do, I'm going to cover these ones first, is to transfer the risk. So let someone else do it and let them worry about the associated risks. Now, there are usually 2 things you can do to transfer a risk. The first is to actually insure. So if I have products, I'm worried about them going bad, I can insure them. If something goes wrong, the insurance company pays for that. And the other thing is you can actually outsource. So you get another company, say, listen, you take care of my distribution, okay, 3PL or 4PL. You take care of my warehousing. You take care of my sourcing. And once you transfer the risk, of course, you're going to have to pay a fee for that. And the higher the risk, the more you're going to have to pay because it's simple mathematics. High risk, high reward, low risk, low reward. Mitigation and contingency are the other 2 we're going to talk about. So mitigation means most times, not all the time, but most times it means what are the things I can do to actually reduce the probability of the risk event getting realized. Contingency is what are the things that I can do to reduce the impact of the risk if it happens. So mitigation, I want to cross the road. To reduce the probability of being hit by a car, you know what? I'm going to wait for the traffic light. I'm going to cross at the zebra crossing. I'm going to look left and right before I cross. That's all of these things are to reduce the chance of being hit by a car. Now, if you get hit by a car anyway, the result is the same, but we're just reducing the probability of it happening. Contingency is rather different. That's okay. The problem happened. What are we going to do about it now? What's the plan B? I work with a supplier. If the supplier went bankrupt, so what do I do now? Contingency would be, well, you know what? I have a backup supplier for that specific item. Now, how do we apply these in supply chain management? I'm going to focus today on 2 things, the procurement element of supply chain and the fleet management element or transportation element of supply chain. Mitigation strategies associated with supply chain risks. The 6 most common ones are, first of all, volume distribution. So don't issue all your purchase orders to a single supplier. Although it would be nice to have one supplier because it's a lot less work, but ideally you want to always have a second backup supplier or a lot of people give them to 80% to my best supplier and 20% to the other supplier. And also, don't just distribute the number of suppliers, try to distribute it geographically. So one supplier is in China, the other is in, let's say, Mexico. Why? Because what if a geographic risk gets realized, like the coronavirus in China? If all my suppliers are in China, they're all gone. But if I have one somewhere else, like in India or Mexico or in Europe, then that would make it easier for me. Know who you're dealing with, okay? Try to do your homework on who you're buying from, and the most extensive way of doing that would be to actually pre-qualify the team. And when we pre-qualify, we look at 5 different things here. Everything to do with the legality of the company, who owns the company, where they're registered, which banks do they deal with, references, and so on. Number 2 is the financials. So let me look at the last 3 or 5 years. Let me look at your financial performance. Is this a growing company? Is it a healthy company financially or not? Because you don't want them to go bankrupt in the middle of a project. The third thing is we look at the technical capabilities, we look at the sustainability practices that they have, and the fifth thing is we look at their actual people, the key people at the company, like the leadership team or key people in key positions. Sourcing geography, so we spoke about that as we spoke about volume distribution. One approach is to actually open a physical map, a world map, and to map out every single supplier, every single sub-supplier, and also map out your production facilities and your customer locations and main hubs, so that you have a good reading of how something like an earthquake or war or a virus outbreak can actually be hedged. We're going to look at also relationship restructuring. So sometimes if you're dealing with very high risk suppliers, you try to enter into partnerships, okay, to keep them for the long term. You might actually acquire the company, okay? You do things to change the nature of the relationship so that your supplier isn't really stronger than you are, but you have more clout than them. Something else you can do is joint process improvement, which is really a strategy to involve yourself across the value chain of the supplier. So let's say you're buying fruits from a certain supplier. Instead of just having a buyer-supplier relationship, maybe you can get involved in the transportation. Maybe you can get involved in the treatment or the ripening of the fruits. Try to get involved at different points of the value chain so that you secure the supplies. And finally, product specification improvement. If you are dealing with raw material that is very limited, that is very rare, that only exists, is only supplied by 1 or 2 suppliers, try to change your product so that you're not really dependent on 1 or 2 vendors. You want to reduce the risk associated with sourcing the product over here. So one example is take IKEA, the furniture store. IKEA, when it comes to wood, okay, they don't use cedar wood and walnut wood and rosewood and all that, because each of these has a lot. It comes from a certain geography. It has a certain limited number of suppliers, etc. So what they do is they just go for the medium density fiberboard. They said, you know what? Let's just standardize the wood. We're going to use medium density, which is actually a processed type of wood. Now they actually cut out all those bottlenecks, and by changing the product specifications, it's become a lot easier for them to deal with those. So that's sourcing. We're going to talk a little bit about transportation as well. Similarly, you need to educate yourself on the insurance policies associated with transportation. Try to really understand the Incoterms, okay, the international commerce terms. By the way, the 2020 terms are now effective. It's optional, of course. You can still go with the 2010, but they've made 3 minor changes here as a side note. Now, with the Incoterms, a lot of people are not very clear on, okay, where does the risk get transferred? Okay, who's paying what? Supplier or the buyer. So that's very important to understand. Designing KPIs to incentivize cargo loss avoidance behavior is very important as well. So rather than paying for a journey, pay for a journey that's completed in full where the goods arrive intact, for example. Incentivize them on the time. Instead of paying for the journey, say, oh, I'm going to pay you, but you have to arrive within a certain time frame. Know who you're doing business with across all modes of geography and geographies. So who's my truck provider? Who's my boat or vessel provider? Who's my train rail provider, airline provider, and so on. Assess your risk and know the value of your shipments. I was told once of this company that shipped one container, so we're talking about a 40-foot container, but the value of the items in the container came to $40 million. So $40 million in one place, that's a lot of money. So here, what you want to do is you want to consider spreading those lots so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket. And finally, you need to really be able to, especially in today's world, monitor and control the shipping information across the entire journey. Okay, if it's perishable goods like medicine requiring refrigeration, you need to measure it from end to end of the supply chain, temperatures, humidity levels, etc., at every level, so that if you have a problem, if there's a hiccup, if the temperature drops or goes up at any stage, you need to be clear on where that happened and why that happened. So these are the two areas we focused on. Of course, risks related to the warehousing, operations, inventory management, reverse logistics, and the digital infrastructure in general. All of these will have risks that you'll really need to dig into. Now, if you'd like to learn more about these risks, more about the strategies, we just spent 30 minutes or 25 minutes or so talking about this in brief. But we have, at Meirc, we offer two courses dedicated to this topic. The first being the SILT-endorsed supply chain operations, where we talk about continuity and we talk about sustainability. In this course, what we talk about is what are the things that we have to do to strengthen our immunity as a supply chain, so that you don't get sick in the first place, you don't have get affected, by the risk. And then, if a problem happens, am I healthy enough to actually bounce back quickly and effectively? The second course is the SILT-endorsed supply chain risk management, where we actually go through the 5 steps of the risk management process in detail, and we cover more advanced strategies in more detail. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please post them now, and I'll be more than happy to answer. So I have a question from Ahmad. Thank you, Ahmad, for that. How to deal with risks in the event of wars? Again, that's a very good question. Whether it's wars or something else related to geography, anything that is localized geographically, you will have to expand your geography. So here, take a map, open up the map, and look at where the suppliers are. Your key suppliers. I'm not talking about suppliers of stationery, etc., but the key components and raw material. Look at where your processing plants are. Look at where your production plant is, and look at the different ports that you use and the customers. And then make sure that these are actually spread out geographically. Don't put everything in the same region if you can. And that's why large companies, especially in the region, are expanding in scope geographically. You see, like Toyota, they have plants in the US, they have plants in Europe, they have plants in Japan. Why? Because if you have a problem in Japan, you don't want the company to die. Okay, so you can spread yourself geographically. I hope that helps answer the question. Thank you, Emmanuel. Hello to you as well. I believe you're from Ghana. How to deal with risks? Okay, we read that. Excellent. So if there are no other questions, thank you very much. I will be sharing a copy of the presentation with everyone who signed up for the course, and I look forward to remaining in touch. Thank you very much.
Meirc.com